Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about public perception of science in a post-pandemic world. My name is Dominique Brossard. I'm a professor and chair in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's a pleasure for me to be with you today. But first, I have to say congratulations on being accepted in the Master of Science Communication at Fiocruz. You're such in good time with my colleague and friend Luisa, and I'm really looking forward to potentially being able to come and visit you face-to-face in the near future. In the meantime, I'm here on Zoom talking to you from Madison, Wisconsin. I'm going to share my screen here to be able to give you a few slides to talk about public perception of science in a post-pandemic world. I'm on Twitter, by the way. My Twitter handle is BrossardDD, and I hope you will actually follow me because I really enjoy also interactions through social media platforms. So as I was telling you, I'm at UW-Madison here in the north of the United States. As you can see, our building at UW-Madison that Lisa knows really well since she stayed for us for a while. Hiram Smith Hall is close to the border to Canada. We have a lot of lakes. It's actually very pretty. And the way the lakes look like that, here you go, the capital of Madison. This is Lake Monona, which is really frozen right now and full of snow. Very beautiful for people that like snow and like the cold. But coming back to what we're doing here at UW-Madison in the Department of Life Sciences Communication that we call LSC, a lot of the things you're going to be studying in your course of study at Fiocruz. We cover science communication research, risk communication research, and public opinion research. So basically understanding how people feel about science, science issues, public perception of science in general, and different issues in particular, such as global change, climate change, food safety, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and so on. And what I'm going to talk about today is public perception of science in a post-pandemic world that really are at the intersection of all those areas of studies will really mention and give you like a brief overview of what we know right now based on our research here and our colleagues around the world related to public perception of science. So what impacts public perception of science in general, and did the pandemic likely to change how this is happening? Well, what we know from decades of research in the science of science communication is that there's different layers of things that impact how people perceive science in general and new science and new technology in particular. First, at the individual level, people like me, level characteristics that are individual, such as knowledge, education, attitudes, and so on, are actually impacted how we feel about science. But more broadly construed around each individual is what we call the information climate. The information climate are everything we see around us that actually tell us something about that new science, so media messages, education systems, and so on. But broadly construed around that information climate, we are surrounded by what we call the social, political, and cultural context. Every context is different. That information clients in Brazil will be very different from the information client in United States. The information client, let's say in Salvador de Bahia, will be different than Rio de Janeiro, or in Madison, Wisconsin, very different for California, for example. So when we think about public perception of science, we really need to think of those three levels. What really concerns each person and their baggage, the experience, where they come from, and so on, the climate that they are on as far as information, and the social, political, and cultural context broadly construed. So I'm going to briefly actually outline some of those contexts, but I'm going to spend more time in the individual level characteristics. So if you think of that, the political, socio-political context, what we know that impacts how people feel about science in general and the new science in particular, those perception of science, is how people, is the context of religion. Is religion very important in that area that we're thinking about? What are the laws and what are the institutional contexts that will impact science in general and how science is deployed? What's the socio-economic context? What are the level of poverty? What are the level of health literacy? What are the level of, medical support and so on? All those are things that I really do not change from one individual to the other, really, and then depend on the context. The information climate is a little more complicated in the sense that if we want to study to see how it impacts public perception of science, we need to take into account a lot of things that I'm sure you're going to cover in your wonderful master. The nature of media coverage, obviously, the marketing messages that actually talk about science and that impact, how people may feel about the science fiction films, educational messages, really a lot of those potential media contexts broadly construed that go way beyond the news and way beyond journalistic accounts. Because when you think about the way science communication has changed, it has really transformed how it used to be. We used to have those trusted translators of science, which were very good science journalists that were really covering science for us and making that transition from what's happening in science labs and so on to society. In the United States, there were like mainly white males, unfortunately, at that point, that actually have been leaving, like news rooms and have actually been moving to other things because the journalism landscape had changed a lot. And again, from different countries, from one country to the other, this is going to be different. And in Brazil, you may have very excellent columns still happening with excellent science writers, but around the globe, we can see that this is really diminishing. And now science is actually translated maybe more in direct way through scientists themselves, and more likely through those information platforms that have all moved online. At the end of the day, we can be all, producing science coverage by actually looking at everything that's online at the tip of our fingers through our smartphones and so on. And if you think about it, when we look, ask people where they find out information about science, they will tell us, at least those that have the potential to use, the internet. That's why the social political context is very different, right? From one part to the other. They will answer that they Google, and that's the first thing they do. Here I did a research on COVID-19 vaccines, and you can see that I have a lot of different headlines here in the United States, because that's how my search was going on at that point, but that actually are covering COVID-19 vaccine with very different angles. But let's remember also that people turn out to other type of platform to find out about science. And one that's been very popular in the United States, and I know that in Brazil as well, is YouTube. And if you look at COVID vaccine search on YouTube, you can see that actually the results will be very different. But why am I showing all this, and how is that related to post-pandemic perception of science? Well, when you think about that information climate I was telling you about, is shaped by every stakeholder that have something to do with the issue at hand. In the context of COVID-19, for example, the mass media obviously is covering COVID-19, but also the policymakers that are making the rules for mask wearing and so on. The research academic institutions that are putting press releases out there related to COVID-19. The environmental group and the health organization that have something to do in the policy debate around the pandemic, activist group, farmers groups, and so on. So all those groups inform that information climate, influence policy debates about science, and at the end of the day will actually color that information climate that individuals are embedded on when they're trying to make sense of scientific issues. And that's where those individual characteristics have, something to do about science. Because when we are thinking about public perception of science, at the individual level, we will be filtering what we see at the mass media and other information climate level around what we have as personal experience, attitudes, and so on. But I need to tell you one very important thing, and you're going to hear a lot about this in your master. There's still a myth around that if people have negative attitude towards science or new innovations and so on, is because they have not enough knowledge about it or they don't understand science. And this is a myth that we used to call, that we're still calling the deficit model approach to science attitudes. But if you look at all the research we've done around the world about this topic, we can see that individuals' knowledge about science or the understanding of science only accounts for like a very small amount of explanation of how they feel about scientific issues and how they feel about perception of science in general. And this was true before the pandemic, is true during the pandemic, and it's most likely going to be true, of course, after the pandemic as well, because at the end of the day, when you think about how people form perception of science, it's what we call heuristics, mental shortcuts, things that actually make them really quickly reach a conclusion without to have to think very much about it, that is going to explain how they feel about science. Because what we call science literacy, the levels of science knowledge, and how they may be related to public perception of science, again, there's been different labels for that. We have called that knowledge deficit model, science literacy model, etc. And that assumption that if people were only more informed, they would be more supportive of science, and effective communication is about explaining the science better. Decades of research have actually explained there's a little support for that science literacy model. Information and knowledge matters in different ways to different people. And when you think about public perception of science, those mental shortcuts that I talked to you about, those heuristics are going to be very powerful about explaining how people feel. If you think about how people felt about mask wearing, for example, this has been very controversial in the United States. This is a photo from Nevada, where there was a lot of resistance to mask wearing. With here, you can see we will not comply with the mask mandate. The science was telling that they should do mask wearing to protect themselves. And it was by rejecting that mandate, that was not because they didn't trust science, is because of other, reasons that I won't get into here. But really, knowledge and information was not what made these people react that way. Because at the end of the day, information and knowledge levels matter in different ways to different people. And it's because what we called, media frames, these are providing cues to audiences to actually react to information depending on a lot of things, such as their former attitudes, their perception of risk benefit, their trust in the different expert that say something, and so on. So what we call media frame that provide cue to audiences, they do so through headlines, sources cited, and visual metaphors, and so on. I give you an example here that actually was a media story that came out in January here in the United States. And the story's title is Gene Therapy, Not a Vaccine. Most vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine here, has actually relied on RNA to actually, been produced and so on. And there's been a media conspiracy around the United States that say that this is not a vaccine, there was gene therapy. So you see this article here. Put it into context that in United States, there's a very strong genetic engineering, GMOs here. This headline is going to prompt people to think, oh my God, this is like GMOs. I do not like GMOs. Dr. Martin is a doctor, therefore I should believe Dr. Martin, therefore I should not take the vaccine. I'm just actually, obviously, everything I said right now, it's wrong, but this is the type of mental shortcut, a type of psychological processing that people would actually do when they see this type of media frames. And these media frames, when we think about perception of science, they're not operate in a vacuum, because at the end of the day, really much like when you look at the painting in a museum, and this frame and the way it looks will actually impact how you think about the painting, the media frames are processed through our own filters. And I was telling you at the institutional level, that could be the level of religion and importance in a country, but at the individual level is the strength of those religious beliefs that may be at odds with what science tells us, or what the morality that we attach to some scientific environments, or the deference to scientific authority and how we feel strongly about those scientific experts. As a result, if you think of perception of science and how it relates to media coverage, any given frame may mean very different things to different people. And therefore, it's extremely important to actually understand how those media frames are deployed in a specific context. So in a nutshell, when you think about science and public perception of science, what we call low information publics make sense of information through different filters. We said low information public because all of us, we do not like to think more than we need. And we're going to take information in and as little as we can, or as much as we wish, in order to make sense of science-related issues. And without really thinking about it, we're going to think about how much information we need to have to decide about this science issue, taking into account how the media around me interpret and define this, and how much those interpretations fit with our belief system and our values that we use as filters to make sense of science-related information. So science perceptions are complicated, and a lot of things that our research has mentioned as important and potentially impactful in public perception of science pre-pandemic and during the pandemic and post-pandemic most likely as well, are things like at the individual level, such as political ideology, attitude toward technology and science, knowledge about the issue, moral consideration, perception of risk benefits, how much we talk about it with others, interpersonal exchanges, trust in information providers, and deference of science. So this is a laundry list that actually come up in our research, are factors that we need to take into account when we think about perception of science. And I'm going to finish with just a few words about two very important concepts: the trust and the deference to science authority. Because the science of science communication again and again tell you that when we talk about public perception of science, acceptance of a message about science is often more closely related to the perceived trustworthiness of the messenger than the content of the message itself. In other words, if you trust the messenger, you're going to trust the content. If you do not trust the messenger, you're going to reject the content of the message. And communication that does not account for the values of the audience and their concern can be worse than not communicating at all. And we think that actually post-pandemic, that's going to be even more important to think about, as far as like, how can we make sure we take into account the concerns of the values of the people we are trying to communicate it? Because in order to maintain trust and credibility, we need to avoid a lot of things. First of all, we shouldn't ignore and downplay perception of risk and concern. People have been extremely impacted by this pandemic around the world, and it's going to be even more important that we actually make sure that we listen to those that have perception of risk and concern, particularly since they may have felt behind in the context of the pandemic. Number two, if we try to persuade our audience that experts are right and their perceptions are wrong, this is going to backfire and potentially impact perception of science even more so than it may have been done before. Number three, we should not conceal risk and scientific uncertainty. A mistake that has been done during the pandemic is portray science as more certain than it was. And then we had to change the type of things we were telling people to do based on new science that was coming up and was telling us more about the vaccine and the potential way the pandemic was transmitted. So important to actually acknowledge scientific uncertainty when it exists in order to maintain trust in science in a pandemic world. And obviously, I was telling you before, assume that education is the only answer to a lot of problems that we face as far as science is concerned is likely to backfire. So in sum, for an effective science communication in a post-pandemic world, and to make sure that we address that issue of public perception of science, we need to remember that that concept of frame is extremely important. Some are likely to resonate for the audience, and they are relevant to a specific social context, and others are not. And when you think about it, there are very few real anti-science people. People may differ in the degree of hesitancy for different science issue, and our job is to understand why and how, but at the end of the day, public perception of science are positive and are likely to stay so in a post-pandemic world. But trust matters, and fear of the unknown is critical. So we should not take for granted that people trust scientists, and we need to make sure that we work to actually making understanding of how people perceive science in general and specific science disciplines and specific scientific issues very, very clear before we actually attempt to communicate. So that means that we need to know our target audience, their value, their motivation, their perception of risk benefit for different issues, which will develop and change with societal development in a post-pandemic world. So I thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to discussing all of you these face-to-face. Thank you.